Hi, and welcome. This today is going to be a little bit of a different video than I usually do because we are going to be talking about 3D printing human remains. But before that, I'm going to talk a little bit about the skull that I have with me right here. So what you're seeing here is the 3D print of a human cranium with injuries on its left and front side. A small square hole above the left eye and on the left cheekbone was probably caused by a pole weapon or a battle axe. The gash across the mouth could have been caused by a sword or a thin-bladed axe. This cranium is actually one of the several thousand artifacts that was found in a mass grave outside of Vispe on the island of Gotland. All of these remains or objects that were found on the site stem from a battle between Gotland peasants and Danish mercenaries on July 27th, 1361. Here is a recreation of what he might have looked like. Now, this skull in particular is from the Historical Museum in Sweden and is part of one of the many collections that contain human remains from that museum, but this one was chosen specifically to commemorate the historical event on the 27th of July was 1361. Now, there are thousands of positives for having 3D printed artifacts from museum, like making the information that we have more accessible to the main public. But not only that, the efforts of 3D scanning and 3D printing has been used in a lot of conservationist activities and projects as well. But most of the time, those artifacts are inanimate objects. How can we apply the same kind of ethics when we're printing real organic material or osteological material like this? Now, many people believe that the way that we can differentiate between the inanimate objects and the organic material like this, which are way more sensitive, is sort of defining what differs original skeletal material and 3D data and how it's stored. And with that, in simple term, it sort of means that there is a dissonance between the photographic photo of a skeleton and the real original skeletal material, and that 3D is somewhere in between the two. And this relates into the way how it's stored based on who owns it, who has rights and who has ownership to it, where's the copyright. And what do we do when we have skeletal material or human remains that come from a dubious provenience, which means they've been looted or taken? Because you'll be surprised to know that for skeletal and human remains in museums worldwide, there are rules for how we sort of deal the information and how we sort of protect it and store it. But for 3D prints, there really aren't any. There was, for example, a huge controversy in Norway a couple of years ago when an artist 3D scanned some columns from Beijing and sort of displayed them in Norway. They're now on their way back to Beijing because he didn't have the rights for them and it was seen as a form of cultural appropriation. Now, one idea for ensuring consistency for dealing with digitized human remains is being able to create a common consensus on how we store and how we distribute the data around them, which essentially means we need guidelines. Now, we're far away from making uniform consensus on what those guidelines should be, but at the Museum of British Associations of Biological Anthropology and Osteoarchaeology, they've made a start by drafting some certain set of rules. For starters, there should be consent forms for the people donating their bodies to science, making sure that we're legally allowed to 3D scan them and then reproduce them in 3D prints. However, that's pretty difficult when the person's been dead for over 800 years. But that doesn't make it any less important to try and find the relatives of the people that are donating or relatives of the deceased who've been dead for longer periods of time and make sure that the consensus and consent can be given. And when these parameters can't be met, the best way is to contextualize the reason for the scan and why we're doing research on this specific cranium. Like, for example, what was the site like? What were the materials you were working with? What's the context of the find itself? And I'm not saying this like it's super easy for anyone to go and 3D scan human remains and then just put it online. Most museums have a strict process on getting access to human remains. And like I said before, this specific cranium, the only reason that it's online is to sort of symbolize a very specific historical event and the research associated with that event. But essentially it comes down to justification, like why are you doing what you're doing and why do you need human remains to do it? Like my reason for 3D printing the skull is to showcase how accessible the technology is, but also how easy it is for someone who doesn't really have a connection to the field, although I do, to get access to these specific files. Now, there are also people who would love for there to be sort of a data link between the 3D print and the one who downloaded it. essentially making it so that museums can see who's got access to their material and who's been downloading it and printing it. Doug Boyer said a very interesting thing about especially this. We encourage the contributor to set access levels such that they feel comfortable with the risks incurred. Incurred, actually. That's on me. And he goes on to say, if they're publishing datasets, it means they're taking on the risk that someone may use data for something they were not intending it to be used for, which unfortunately is the risk with having such an open source program like, for example, Sketchfab, where I got this skull from. So, to summarize what I've been saying, essentially what we need if we're going to have open sources and be able to freely distribute this kind of remains to the main public so that it can be more accessible and people can learn more and can preserve more for history, there has to be a sort of digital constitution. Those were my opinions on 3D archaeology for now. Let me know if you guys want any more. I'll see you guys in the comments.